This is Radio Free Assange.
They are about to take every right away from you. You will not be able to fight for any other cause. We are talking about the fundamentals here. We must fight against the extradition. We must save Julian Assange.
Every single, all the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world dedicating significant resources over the past 10 years to destroying his reputation. So it's at a stage now where it's actually you risk something to even defend him. So the facts are very hard to get out, but when you start looking into it, you see that actually this is not a fair trial at all, and from start to finish it's been irregular. And it's actually a real stain on the British state and the British justice system that they won't live down. I mean, when Edward Snowden tweeted when Assange was grabbed from the embassy by British police, he said something along the lines of this will define Britain's attitude to the free press for generations, and it's true. I mean, that image will live in infamy. So we need to make sure Britain does not become a party to what would be one of the biggest nails in the coffin of the free press that the world has ever seen, maybe the biggest nail in the coffin. So, and for all the people that are watching who live in Britain, you live in the most important jurisdiction for any kind of activism on this topic, because if he goes to the US, he's got no chance. The real chance he has to avoid and his life be saved and avoid extradition is in the UK. So we really need to focus efforts in the run-up to September to expose the irregularities, to expose the bias, and try and get justice.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We're discussing here whether Assange or someone else has done something wrong or not. But what about the war crimes? We are living in a time when our own war crimes are no longer prosecuted. We know that we have conducted aggressive wars. We've hanged people on Nuremberg for this. 175 years for whatever we're accusing Mr. Assange of. It certainly is not violence, certainly is not genocide, certainly is not massacring civilians or torturing anybody. And people for genocide in The Hague, they received 35 or 45 years.
Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange!
You're listening to
Free Assange
Radio.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Basically, I think that Julian Assange is he's a very brave guy. He's a fantastic journalist. He's one of the sort of he's basically being put in prison because he's too good. That's the problem. He's the promise of a free media, which we haven't really had before. We've just had propaganda, and I think that's basically why he's these sort of powerful states such as Britain and the US can't live with him.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange! Free!
Testimony from Professor Koppelman, a psychiatrist who has evaluated Julian Assange. I must say that it's very hard, and I want to point out that Ed Fitzgerald, the QC for Julian Assange, pointed out to the media that they would be considerate in reporting on such a delicate matter. and I intend to do the same. But we heard this morning, of course, that Julian has been diagnosed with depression. He is at a high suicide risk, especially if he is extradited to the United States. He has syndrome, Asperger's, that makes him 9 times more likely to commit suicide than other persons. So all this together should give the court the right picture. He is in no state in severe danger of causing self-harm if he is extradited. It was quite, in my opinion, appalling to listen to the lengthy cross-examination by the lawyers for the American government, trying to pick apart every small detail, citing records constantly for over an hour from Belmarsh prison and the medical staff there. The medical staff who obviously have an interest in keeping the records such that the prison cannot be accused of anything if a prisoner self-harms. And we know that Julian did not have full faith and confidence in the people, the medical people in Belmarsh prison, and for obvious reasons. So that sort of sums it up. It's only lunchtime. Professor Koppelman will be cross-examined further by the QC for the Americans this afternoon, and it is quite extraordinary to hear the questions which are indicative of their willingness to try to establish that Julian Assange is simply making it up, which I think is appalling in all respect. But that was what went on this morning.
the court. So yet again, the defendant hasn't been present at an important procedural hearing, and there have been a whole series of questions around his health raised in relationship to the case. And we're very lucky today to be joined by three doctors from the campaigning organisation Doctors for Assange, who've been doing some absolutely tremendous work around this issue. We were just discussing before the programme began, and none of us could remember a time when it's even been necessary for doctors en masse to start writing letters, having articles published in the Lancet, the premier medical journal in this country, raising an issue like that. But that's exactly where we've been in recent months. So to discuss that, I'm very happy to be joined by my first speaker, who's Dr. Lisa Johnson. She's on the line from Australia. Very welcome here, Lisa. She's a columnist with the New Matilda, and she's been a driving force behind the organisation Doctors for Assange. So let's start the programme with you. Just tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing and why you felt it was necessary to even intervene in this way with other members of the medical profession.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, I mean, I guess my involvement with Doctors for Assange, kind of going back, starts with the fact that I've been writing about the psychology of politics and social issues for about 6 years. And since the beginning of 2019, I've confined that really solely to Julian Assange's persecution, because all of the issues that I care about and write about, you know, systemic abuses, you know, economic and racial injustice and oppression, all really lost causes, and fighting those abuses is a lost cause, I feel, if the abuse of Julian Assange stands. So I joined Doctors for Assange. Well, last year, as people will know, Niels Meltzer in March issued his report that, or was it May, that Julian Assange was suffering from all symptoms typical of prolonged exposure to psychological torture. And you know, that's an extraordinary thing. He said that's a result of collective persecution and mobbing by a group of ostensibly democratic states, and he'd never seen anything like that in his 20 years of working with victims of war and persecution. And you know, that torture and abuse has been ongoing and escalating in Belmarsh prison, to the extent that in November last year, Niels Meltzer issued a warning that the inhumane conditions there could soon end up costing Julian Assange his life. And at the time, Julian had appeared earlier than that, in I think it was October, at a hearing looking very frail, prematurely aged, struggling to answer basic questions about his name and his date of birth. So the doctors were moved to write a letter to the UK government at that time, and I got involved then, and since then we've written 2 letters to the UK government and a series of letters, I think 3, to the Australian government, and published a letter in the Lancet medical journal calling for an end to the torture and medical neglect of Julian Assange. And in the letters to governments, essentially what we've been trying to convey to governments is the medical seriousness of Niels Meltzer's findings. And we've been really impressing upon governments that you know, being exposed to prolonged psychological torture is a life-threatening condition. And you know, we've been saying that prison is really a medically dangerous place for a torture victim. And we've said in a letter to the Australian government, you know, it's just a fundamental fact here that you can't adequately medically treat a torture victim while continuing to torture them, which is exactly what's happening in Belmarsh prison. So now with coronavirus in Belmarsh prison, that represents really a significant escalation of both the medical neglect and the torture. There are 2 aspects of Julian Assange's torture that are really being intensified by that. One is exposure, being rendered helpless in the face of threat. That's been, you know, something that's been there for the last 10 years, and now he's really being, with his emergency bail application being denied in March, he's essentially being placed in harm's way of a deadly virus. He's medically vulnerable to the lethal effects of COVID-19. Because of persistent respiratory issues, but also because of a long history of fragile health and medical neglect in the Ecuadorian embassy, and the immunosuppressive effects of psychological torture. And one of the things we spelled out in a lot of detail to the Australian government is that psychological torture doesn't just cause psychological harm, it causes physical harm. And part of that is to have suppressed immunity. So you know, that's an escalation of the neglect and the torture, and also under coronavirus restrictions, the amount of time he's in solitary confinement has increased to 23 hours a day. That's a very significant aspect of his psychological torture. So it's really a matter of medical urgency that he's out of prison. And it's also a matter of democratic urgency. You know, he's there because he's a journalist and he's being tortured because of journalism. And really the doctors' fight for Julian Assange's life and health is inextricable, I think, from the broader fight for the life and health of our democracies. You know, and one of the functions of torture is to send a message by gruesome example that this is what will happen to you. In this case, this is what will happen to journalists who seriously and genuinely hold the powerful to account. You know, it's imperative that Julian Assange is out on medical grounds and on democratic grounds. Otherwise, you know, our democracy is going to be on life support with journalism if we don't end the torture and medical neglect of Julian Assange.
Okay, Lisa, thanks very much for those opening remarks. Now, I want to move on to my second guest, who's Derek Summerfield. Derek's an honorary senior lecturer at London's Institute for Psychiatry. We're very glad to have you here, Derek. Lisa raised a whole raft of complex issues to do with the medical conditions and medical treatment of Julian Assange. Just give us your initial sort of overview of this case.
Well, I suppose I'm speaking as a doctor, but really as a sentient citizen as much as anything else. I had a decade as the chief psychiatrist of the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture. So clearly the issue of people under pressure, people whose identity may have been damaged or destroyed, or they're struggling to retain it, is fairly familiar to me. And certainly some of the hallmarks of this case bear this out. Just to say, this case demonstrates in many ways the role that the British government and indeed possibly the Australian government are playing in respect to the US. It seems for the last 7 years, the end game for the British government has been to hand this man over to the US, and that is that. And yet this is a matter we're talking about, something that touches our deepest aspirations with regard to the kind of society we run. Julian Assange seems to me is a cutting-edge citizen. This is what citizenship should amount to. These are war crimes. We've seen them on some of the pictures that were released. These are war crimes. We all need to know about this. This could not be a more fundamental question for the freedom of journalism and indeed the freedom of civilians and for voters to be in touch and support what their governments are doing ostensibly in their name. Trump is applying the Espionage Act for the first time to persecute journalism per se. The extraterritorial application of US espionage laws to journalistic activities in Britain seems to be an extraordinary thing. And one thing that should emerge in this hour is the extent to which they have sought to, it seems, to isolate and destabilize the whole case for Julian Assange and Assange himself, down to spying on his lawyers, it seems, emerged from a Freedom of Information request. And we see here the UK cravenly serving US interests in relation to impunity for war crimes. What that says about our state, what it says about the Australian government's refusal to intervene with one of their citizens is something that surely is filtering through in this next hour and carries the sense of the kind of exceptionalism that the US and its allies have with regard to everything, including the press. I might just say that the role played by the UN Rapporteur Melster since last year has been extraordinary. I've been involved in various anti-torture campaigns and have had contacts with 2 or 3 of his predecessors. They are very hard to get to turn your way. You know, they have their own thing. The way that this has captured Niels Melson and the words he's used, both the sense of language like psychological torture, but also the feeling that he's never seen an individual case so picked on at every level as this one, is something that just does not happen every day at the level of UN rapporteurs. It's quite extraordinary. So those are reflections as much as a citizen, as a doctor. I think we probably will come on a little more to some of the issues that come out of Lisa's remarks about the role of torture and how it renders a person. We do understand, we've seen evidence that Julian Assange's demeanor and general composure has been quite erratic at times, and at times raising questions about his capacity to properly inform his lawyers, whatever. None of this seems to be accidental from the very beginning. The solitary, the whole business, and the whole thing is an utter disgrace about which all of us must speak up.
Derek, thanks very much for that. Now, before I move on to our final guest, I just want to remind those people looking in, if you're looking in on Zoom, there's a question and answer function on the bottom toolbar. If you're looking at a computer, if you're looking from iPhone or iPad, you can find it in other places. Do remember, you can ask questions directly to the panel. Just pop those questions into the Q&A, and I'll try and see if I can get them through to you. If you're watching on other social media, our media team are looking out for questions being asked there, and they'll feed them through to me if they can. So you'll be able to directly get answers to things that are of importance to you from our team. But now, final guest, Dr. Bob Gill. We're very pleased to have you here. Now, if any of you are involved in the politics of defending the NHS in the UK, you're very likely to know Bob Gill. He's done some tremendous campaigning work in that area. He's the producer of the great NHS Heist, and it's terrific to have you on this programme, Bob. So just give us some opening remarks about why you think this case is important.
Thank you, John, and thank you for allowing me to be part of your very important work. DEA is doing a great job in highlighting the plight of one of the most important people the world has at the present time. Just to give an overview, we should all be in no doubt the importance of journalism and a free press in a democracy. Without that, democracy becomes a sham, and a lot of the journalism we are exposed to from mainstream media resembles more propaganda than journalism. And what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks achieved was the ability to expose the crimes of states, be that regime change wars like in Iraq, or crimes of states against their own populations, such as mass surveillance. And my particular experience around the NHS, well, the privatization of the NHS represents to me a crime of the UK government against the population of England. And privatization is a legalized form of fraud and corruption. It's handing over a state asset to private corporations. And much of the work WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have done have been to shine a light on how the military-industrial complex and financial interests and oligarchic individuals are pulling more and more finance and control into their own grasp. So they've decided to make an example of Julian and locking him up for having convicted no crime, but his only offense has been to reflect the crimes of our leaders. And that's what he's been guilty of. But the other thing we share in common with the United States, not only our government colluding with them against what is effectively a political prisoner languishing in Belmarsh prison, but they also share their catastrophic handling of the pandemic. They have failed in their fundamental duty to protect the public. And it doesn't surprise me, they're ideologically aligned, they're right-wing, and they're stacking the interests of corporations above those of the people. The other importance of Julian Assange is how he gave a voice to whistleblowers, how he provided a safe platform for people who wanted to protect themselves against retribution and being allowed a voice to expose fraud, corruption, and criminality amongst our leaders. And coming back to the NHS, I've seen myself and supported various people and also come under pressure myself when revealing the effects of the privatization, the toll it's taken on endangering our patients, and also the psychological trauma experienced by people who are bullied and intimidated into silence. Now, what's happened to Julian Assange is on a far more dramatic scale. He's been practically deprived of his liberty, his freedom, for the best part of a decade. And he's been denied access to his lawyers. So you have a very intelligent man who's effectively, his voice has been silenced, and he's not been able to enjoy life as most of us would, even in lockdown, not experienced a minute proportion of the torture that he has been subjected to. And that's why I was proud to be invited to sign the letter that went out requesting his release and him being able to access medical and psychological treatment. But finally, as a GP, it's great to have the other guests here, Lisa and Derek, to talk about the mental health aspects, but we mustn't separate out how mental health impacts on physical health, how the chronic release of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, take their toll on the body, lead to premature heart disease, push up your blood pressure, push you into diabetes, and as Lisa mentioned, severely dampen your immune response. So Julian is languishing in an environment which, if COVID takes hold, he is not only more susceptible because of the close proximity with other people, but his immune system and his underlying lung conditions put him at very high risk of succumbing to this deadly virus.
Bob, thanks very much. So that's a terrific introduction from all our speakers to the sort of range of issues that we'll be discussing today. I should remind you that if you want to see the range of support that Julian Assange has, you can go to the DEA website, look under statements, and you'll see an enormous range of organisations that are supporting him. And that's a direct response to a question we've already been asked from Caroline Brain, who says, what support are we getting from organisations like Amnesty? Well, Amnesty has indeed issued statements in support of Julian Assange, but it's by a long way not the only organisation, and there's a very impressive series of organisations. My own union, the NUJ, recently issued a very strong resolution in support of Julian Assange, but there are any number of human rights, political organisations, trade union organisations that have made the same kind of statements, and they're all collected on the DEA website. So you can have a look. You can have a look at those. We'll be returning to those campaigning issues towards the end of the hour, but before we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time sort of unravelling two of the main issues which our guests have discussed. And the first of those is the question of the impact of COVID on the prison system. Now, this is the direct reason why Julian has been unable to attend the last three procedural hearings. He can't go to court in Westminster, so the facility available to him is a video link inside the prison and on medical advice passing through the prison and sitting in a video room which every prisoner who's appearing in court uses, has been regarded as a risk to his health. So I'd like to come to you each in turn again to say a few words about how you think the COVID virus has impacted on the prison system, the justice system, and in particular, of course, on Julian's case. So if I come to you first, Lisa, about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we've been saying, there's a variety of reasons that Julian Assange is medically vulnerable to COVID-19, and he meets all of the internationally agreed criteria for prisoner release under COVID-19. You're saying, John, that there's a huge range of organisations supporting Julian Assange, and I mean, I would say that really there's more or less an international consensus, human rights, press freedom, and international law consensus that not only should he be out of prison, but the extradition request should be dropped. And there's also a consensus that people who are detained for without sufficient basis in international law should be released, people who are vulnerable, people who are non-violent, people who are unsentenced, and all of those things apply to Julian. He's in there without any custodial sentence, without any UK charge. under what are just, it's a kind of an experiment in redefining journalism as espionage under the 1917 Espionage Act. So, you know, and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention said shortly after he went into Belmarsh that he's being arbitrarily detained. So it's just egregious to hold him there in conditions that put his life at risk when there's, you know, to be arbitrarily detained, my understanding of that is that it means you're being detained without sufficient basis in due process and law, and now his life is being put, you know, even more acutely at risk than it was just by keeping him there and continuing the psychological torture and the isolation and the medical neglect. It was already dangerous. You know, doctors were already writing to governments before COVID-19 saying, we're concerned that he could die. Niels Melzer is right to issue that warning. He must get out of there as a life-saving measure. And Niels Melzer said, I think it was last year, that, you know, perhaps he could hold out another year, maybe two, or maybe he'll be finished tomorrow. And that's the kind of stress that impacts on immunity. That's the way it works. You can't say with any certainty when someone might succumb to a lethal infection because they're immunocompromised, or cancer because they're immunocompromised, or a heart condition. It's really sort of Russian roulette. So to keep him in there with coronavirus in the mix, when social distancing is impossible in prison, when prisons have been called an epidemiological pump and a breeding ground with explosive transmission, it's just a terrible thing to do. And, you know, he's in there for journalism. An independent Australian MP, Andrew Wilkie, has rightly said recently, you know, the fact that he's in prison in the first place is complete nonsense. And, you know, that's just putting it plainly. So for all those reasons, you know, it's just unconscionable that he's been kept in there during this pandemic.
And Bob, of course, Julian's lawyers did apply in the court for bail on precisely these grounds, that he was at risk in the COVID crisis in Belmarsh. The judge simply slapped that application for bail down. And I guess you could say that that's in line with government policy, because the government talked about releasing some 4,000 at-risk prisoners, and Julian is at risk and also held in jail having committed no crime. So you would have thought prima facie that he would have been one of those most likely to be released. But then the government, in the end, didn't even keep its own promise. It released tiny numbers of prisoners during this crisis.
Yeah, I think it just highlights how perverse so many of the decisions have been in respect to Julian Assange. Convicted of no crime, having numerous high-risk factors that put him in the vulnerable character, keeping him in an environment which also puts him at high risk. You know, one thing after the other goes to demonstrate how the judgments that are being arrived at do not match any sort of rational or logical decision making, and, you know, emphasizes the political nature of his detention. There's no way around that. It makes no sense on any level how he's being treated.
Derek, there's a question here. I certainly don't know the answer to it, and I'm hoping that perhaps you will, from Sarah Saunders, who says, is there a senior appointed UK medical officer ultimately responsible for Julian's well-being? Well, I guess that is a good question. And I mean, I suppose part of the answer would be, well, if there isn't, there should be. But is there?
No, I don't think so. While he's in prison, of course, the prison medical service will have a duty of care to him, as with all prisoners, and that's about it. It is striking that medical bodies like the British Medical Association have, to my knowledge, not weighed in to make any remarks at all. I would say, quite frankly, that's because, in a sense, they are part of the state themselves. Yeah. What Lisa said about his handling in relation to COVID, I think, couldn't be bettered. All you could say is that the attitude of the British government to the COVID question and this prisoner is consistent with the way they have handled the whole case from the beginning. They mean to get rid of this guy. Presumably, they mean to strike a blow against the kind of journalism that the WikiLeaks exemplified. If this is criminal journalism, then I don't know what. I don't know what space is left in our society for cutting-edge journalism about the things that they hide from us. It reflects incredibly badly on not only the US, we expect that, but on the UK and on Australia. And it shows you really, to me, where they're actually at. Whether, noticing some of the chat, one of the chat points, whether things would have been different if a Labour government had been elected, well, under Corbyn, I don't doubt it. So that was a missed opportunity.
Well, there's another question here as well, which says they could put an ankle bracelet on him if they're concerned about his security. Why don't they do that? And of course, that was exactly the offer that Ed Fitzgerald, Julian's QC, made in court when they made the bail application, and that was turned down. I mean, but Bob Gill, this is of a piece with the government's general policy over COVID with the rest of the population, and particularly towards the prisons. I mean, they've just decided to let it rip, essentially, haven't they?
Yeah, I think there's a framing problem amongst the general population who, I suppose, it's comforting to believe and kid yourself that government is acting in the public interest. But time and time again, they have made decisions which ignore the science, ignore the example set by other countries who've successfully handled the coronavirus, and put money into and were forcing hospitals to discharge potentially infected people back to nursing homes, causing a second catastrophe. You have the catastrophe of people catching COVID in the community, hospitals being turned into hotspots, and then creating another hotspot within nursing homes. And if you look at what some of our leaders have publicly stated in terms of how they consider the elderly and the poor as not worthy of being saved, then it shouldn't surprise us that a groundbreaking journalist exposing their crimes also fits into that category. So it doesn't surprise me, but what it does serve is to wake up other people that, yes, our government is capable of making willful decisions to neglect and put people at risk, not only individuals, but the whole population.
Okay, now we've got limited time, so I'd like to move the conversation on now. All three of you have mentioned quite rightly the work of Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and it was he, I think, in a speech which I saw him make at the end of last year, who said that when you say psychological torture, some people regard that as kind of torture light, as if it's sort of in some way less torture than it would be if it were physical torture. And he said we have to think about that differently. It's no less torture because it's psychological torture. So Lisa, let me come to you. I'd be interested to hear what you think about that point.
That's right. Psychological torture isn't something that's well understood or talked about very often. So people probably think, what does he mean, psychological torture? And it's not just sort of suffering and distress. It's extreme psychological harm being caused. It's the psychological equivalent of subjecting somebody to relentless starvation and assault, basically. So you're depriving them of psychological needs that are minimum necessary requirements, basically, for human functioning, for psychological functioning, as well as mental and cognitive functioning. And as we've been talking about, it also causes quite serious physical harm. So, I mean, I guess maybe Derek could talk about things a bit more. He was, chief psychiatrist at the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture, so very much his area. But, two of the main torture tactics that are very common are exposing people to threat and danger and rendering them helpless in the face of incessant, extreme danger, mortal danger. And, that's been there for Julian Assange all along in terms of US extradition. He knows that in the US, Niels Melzer has said he'll be tortured until the day he dies. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has warned about that. So he knows, he's read the memos from Stratfor about he'll make a nice private prison and he'll be eating cat food forever and have his head dunked in a full toilet bowl at Gitmo and that kind of thing. So that's hanging over him. And now he's in Belmarsh prison being rendered absolutely helpless, unable to meet with his lawyers, no access to computers, unable to read documents in the case against him. So I've said in things that I've written that's the equivalent of holding someone bound and gagged in the basement while their assailant stands outside sharpening their knives. So it's not just a little bit of suffering, it's extreme. And then that puts the body through extreme stress. Being in a constant state of physiological arousal from extreme stress is very, very damaging, very damaging. And solitary confinement also because of stress, but also because humans need social interaction. When that's deprived, or people are deprived of that, that's extremely damaging as well. And that causes, even after just 2 weeks, can cause brain changes that can be permanent, memory and concentration changes that can be permanent. And also it's just very deeply damaging psychologically to people. People react differently, but some people very quickly can go into self-harming and losing touch with reality. And, Julian Assange is obviously very psychologically resilient. That hasn't happened to him, but it's an extremely cruel thing. And it's been months that Julian Assange has been in essentially solitary confinement, and more than 2 weeks is considered torture under the UN torture mandate. So it's very serious, very serious.
Derek, as Lisa was saying, this is your field. Just elaborate for us a bit about how this works as torture, as a torture technique.
Well, it's no more my field than anyone's, but it is interesting. It seems from the beginning, I've been pondering, whether the UK government has wanted to be cruel to this man in all these ways that we've been outlining. It was the cruelty aspect, the perverse gathering of pressures placed upon him when they needed to be, which struck Neil Meltzer, I think, right from the beginning, in every sort of aspect. I mean, even things like, spying on him, spying on his lawyers. This man's been, in a sense, socially deprived for 7 years, more or less. I don't know what condition I'd be in. During that period, and particularly now, of course, this amounts to assaults on identity and dignity, doesn't it? Yeah. Instilling helplessness and hopelessness. If he doesn't feel helpless and hopeless, he's certainly been provoked enough into doing it. Public shaming, vilification, all that ridiculous sideshow to do with the rape in Sweden. Yeah. Some sort of sensory deprivation. It's hard to know whether they intended all of this, whether they thought it would make it harder for lawyers to construct a case for him, his capacity to instruct them. I wouldn't necessarily put it past them. But there certainly is this picture that Niels Meltzer put up last year, which has continued in all sorts of little ways. The lawyers finding it hard to get through to him, or having the time they need with him cut down. All these things mark out a general indifference, but also possibly a specific motivation to render him down, it seems.
Bob, of course, one of the horrible ironies about Julian's current situation now, because of the COVID crisis and the way in which the government and the prison system has decided to deal with it, is that he's been returned essentially to conditions of solitary confinement for 23 and a half hours a day. Of course, he was in solitary confinement originally in Belmarsh, and then he was released from it because there was public pressure, and let's underline how important that was, pressure from his expert legal team, but also critically a revolt amongst prisoners in Belmarsh, who 3 occasions said to the governor and the prison authorities, this is not acceptable treatment. So there have been 2 periods, if you like, prolonged periods of solitary confinement. I mean, that in itself is a fantastic mental pressure, isn't it?
I find it hard for any rational person not to consider replacing his ability to associate with other prisoners and choosing the option of solitary confinement as opposed to release. Not a perverse act in itself. At every opportunity, the decisions made have rammed home and amplified the ongoing injustice against Julian. It's difficult for people to imagine for themselves what's going on. But let me put it in simple terms. Being denied freedom of movement, being denied the ability to speak to your friends, being denied the ability to see your children grow up, being denied the prospect of having a relationship with another, intimate relationship with another human being for year after year after year. And, you know, I'm staggered that Julian is still with us, given the intensity of the physical and psychological toll this would take on any of us. So it's remarkable that he has lasted, you know, his resilience under the circumstances has been monumental. And it's easy for us to forget, you know, how we go on about our normal lives. You have this individual who has served the public interest to such a large degree, exposing the crimes of states, paying such a heavy price. And every day this goes on is adding more insult to injury.
Mm. There's a comment here from somebody who's looking in, and there are 400 or 500 people watching this. So do keep sharing this on your social media. If you just push the share button, we'll make sure that this discussion gets through to a larger audience. But one of the points being made here is, how can the UK call itself a law-abiding nation if it keeps Assange in this situation and basically sparks the need for an organisation called Doctors for Assange to come into existence? This seems to be unprecedented. And Derek, can you remember another occasion where so many medical practitioners have felt the necessity to get together to campaign in this way for somebody being held under these conditions? Certainly in this country,
No,
I can't recommend it.
Not particularly, but I have no illusions about the probity of the deep state in this country. After all, many of the offences which the WikiLeaks leaks exposed, including the killing of women and children from helicopter gunships, and clearly identified first helpers, paramedics and the like, arose in the Iraq War, in which Britain went in with America. The idea that this country is basically a fair and stable one. I speak, in fact, as a Zimbabwean rather than as a Briton, I must say, though I've been here many years. The idea is a sort of fantasy that people who don't go into it too much continue to carry, British fair values. I think the UK has long since deserved the Nobel Prize for hypocrisy. So no, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. This is a nasty little state, Britain, nasty in its international impact and its unconditional support of the US and others, and indeed the war crimes in the Middle East by others like Israel. Britain is available for those sorts of allies in their realpolitik. They make deals with rotten human rights regimes abroad. They sell arms to anyone. The man who was the ambassador, was it in Uzbekistan? What was his name? Who sought to blow the whistle there, found his career removed. So am I surprised? I suppose, I'm not surprised in the way that Noam Chomsky, if he was on this program, would say he's not surprised. But I mean, if journalists cannot freely report war crimes, then we're all lost.
Mm. Lisa, with the Doctors for Assange, was there any previous model you thought, oh, they did it for that case, let's see if that worked, or was the thought, look, this is unprecedented, we're going to have to do something that's never been done before? And additionally, perhaps, do you think there's any chance that there might be legal action against the UK government over the treatment of Julian and other prisoners under the COVID crisis?
Well, I mean, in terms of the first part of that, there wasn't the thought that it had happened before, and I can't think of anything like this happening before. It was just sheer alarm that this was happening, alarm that Nils Meltzer had made the statements that he had and Julian was still in prison, alarm that he looked so ill in court. So it was just sheer concern, and the sense that, we're talking about, was it deliberate, the sense that the governments really need to understand, the governments involved really need to understand that this is serious, this is medically serious, this is not just someone's opinion, this is dangerous, he must get out, that's genuine, the fear for his life. So we've explained it in quite a lot of detail especially to the Australian government. We broke down what's all the stuff we've been talking about, what psychological torture is, what it does, why it's medically dangerous. So if they didn't know before, they know now. And Nils Meltzer's informed people in an awful lot of detail, written letters to the states involved, and they haven't responded. So certainly all of the governments involved now have been well and truly brought up to speed on what they're doing and what's involved, and they're continuing to do it. And I mean, on the issue of the UK being a democracy, if there's one thing we know about governments and societies that torture their journalists, it's that they don't treat their citizens well. I mean, and for that reason alone, people should be very concerned about this. And we're seeing that play out in the United States in very dramatic ways right now. After all, it's the US. After Julian Assange, just today, a man in a wheelchair was shot in the face with a rubber bullet. I mean, that, the two things go together, torturing journalists and treating citizens that way, and not tolerating any kind of dissent, and even just exercising democratic rights. In terms of a legal case to answer, I mean, I don't know, but I think, in some of the letters we've said, look, I mean, this is deliberate, this is knowing, this abuse is happening with all of the parties having been informed that this is what they're doing, and they're placing this man's life at risk for journalism. I mean, we can't forget that. It's for practicing journalism in so-called democracies. So if there isn't a legal case to answer, there certainly should be.
Okay. Bob, I want to start just widening out the discussion a little bit here. There's a question that's come in that says, the private company Care UK is one of the main providers of healthcare in UK prisons, but there's absolutely no information about who's accountable, other than that all searches lead to the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty. And apart from that specific question, I just want to use that as a way of jumping into the issue of the importance of whistleblowers within the medical profession. I mean, we've seen all the way through the COVID crisis, tremendous amount of debate about what the government is revealing, isn't revealing, the amount of statistics that is massaged, even a complaint from the National Statistical Authority saying to the government, you're really misleading people here. So, I mean, with Big Pharma, with privatization, with the COVID crisis, how important is it that there are whistleblowers doing the kind of work that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did to the health of the health profession?
There's never been a more important time for health professionals to be able to raise their concerns without fear of losing their livelihoods. The problem is the way the NHS is set up, through having contracts where the consultants are obliged not to bring their trust into disrepute. So you have a mechanism for shutting down dissent there. You have a system of annual revalidation and appraisal, at which point, if you happen to rock the boat, they could terminate your career. And I supported a very high-profile whistleblower in the NHS, Dr. Chris Day, who actually did that at his annual appraisal, and on the same day found his career terminated and questions about his mental health being fabricated. And this was at the height of the junior doctors' dispute. Now, if ever doctors needed to fight back and use an example of a prominent whistleblower, that was it. But as mentioned before, the British Medical Association ignored it and jumped on the bandwagon to actually act against the whistleblower. So what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange provided was a safer way to raise concerns without facing career destruction. And it's very important. I watched a program produced by Sky News, which showed how people working in care homes were able to speak up quite freely. And what was staggering is we haven't seen a whole army of doctors and nurses standing up and saying, we are unable to provide the care we need to. We feel unprotected due to lack of PPE. We are being forced to discharge infected patients back to nursing homes. The fact that that is missing just highlights how entrenched this problem is within the NHS. And you know, because we have a controlled, a top-down system, it is just not possible to raise valid concerns which point to systemic problems which require extra funding, and to do that in a safe way is just not possible, despite all the PR that comes out of government that they respect whistleblowers and all the rest of it. That's all a charade. The reality on the ground is you cannot safely raise concerns and have your identity known. It just does not happen. And one other example that springs to mind is of a doctor who felt it necessary to write to the relatives of a patient who passed away to highlight the problems in his care. The NHS Trust employed fingerprint experts to try and track down the author of that letter. Now, this is the extent in our supposed democracy, which is open and accountable, will go to silence dissent and to silence the raising of concerns. But just before I finish on this point, it is also staggering the impact that the smear operation against Julian has had on progressive, intelligent people. A colleague of mine who, you couldn't fault her politics, was put off by these accusations that were made against Julian Assange. And I think that's switched off a lot of people to the new evidence. And I believe Niels Meltzer said that had an effect on him until he looked deeper into the case, looked into the details of these allegations, and found so many inconsistencies, found so much ignoring of due process. But unfortunately, that has closed the minds of some people, and that's why events like this are important, to get people to relook and to rethink about their impressions of this tragedy and torture of Julian Assange. It's important we look at the evidence, look at the decisions that are being made right now, and look how perverse they are. And any right-thinking person would come to the conclusion that the state is acting against justice and is acting against the individual who exposed their crimes.
Okay, Derek, let me get a few thoughts from you on this, because as we go forward here, Serco are going to be doing the test and trace. AstraZeneca are producing the vaccine. If there isn't the ability of whistleblowers to say what's going on, what's not being said by their governments and by these corporations, it's a question of medical safety to have a whistleblower, isn't it?
It is, and as some brave doctors and others speak out, of course, we can see what the consequences are for some of them. Indeed, I mean, it's quite depressing to look at it at that level. I don't have much faith, I must say, in the medical parastatal organisations like the British Medical Council, the British Medical Association, or the General Medical Council. It's not directly about Assange, but since we're partly talking about torture, just as an example, that in relation to Iraq, I mean, for all I know, that WikiLeaks material might have abutted on this, that evidence has emerged, credible evidence, that up to 40 UK doctors colluded with torture of prisoners in Iraq during the invasion. 40, around 40, that sort of number. I can give you a quote. How many of those have been brought to justice and have had to face, the General Medical Council or whatever? One. And that one came up by accident, I think. So one sees that even the bodies that seem to represent professional probity and independence, the highest values attached to health professions, like the General Medical Council or the British Medical Association, do not do their job. And as I said earlier, effectively operate as shields for government action, I'm afraid. It's a sad matter. And it hasn't really been, I'm surprised, possible to get, I've been surprised by how few medical voices, relatively speaking, have seen what the Assange case is all about and have put their name in public. We have done it, and this is what we're doing now. But it's an uphill matter, and what they don't get is ethical support at the top from their organizations, which would make them feel obliged as citizens to speak out about these matters. That's what they do not get. We see the prior political decisions that have already been made, really, by the UK government, what their political associations are, who they consort with. We see that. And there's a determination to make an example of Assange. Chelsea Manning was pardoned by President Obama as he left. There's the man in Moscow who's beyond reach at the moment, but Assange they have got. And we see this grotesque process being played out.
Okay, well, that's a good moment to say to people looking in, if you want to support the absolutely splendid work that Doctors for Assange have been doing, you can always email them at info@doctorsassange.org or go to the website www.doctorsassange.org and do give that organisation as much help as you possibly can. Now, I want to move on to the sort of last round of questions and to look forward a little bit about what the health implications might be if Julian Assange were to be extradited to the United States. Some of you have already touched on this in the discussion, but we've got a whole bunch of questions about it, raising the question of the so-called special administrative measures that Julian Assange would be under if he were in the prison system in the United States, which would be even more draconian than conditions in Belmarsh, preventing him from speaking in public, preventing his legal team from speaking in public. So, Lisa, let me come to you and just ask you to kind of peer forward through the mists of time and have a look at what that impact on the health of Julian Assange might be if he were ever to land up in the United States.
It would be horrific. It would just be horrendous. You know, during the first phase of the extradition proceedings, Julian's psychiatrist told the court something along the lines that he said he was as confident as any psychiatrist ever could be that if the extradition request was granted, Julian Assange would find a way of killing himself, of suiciding. You know, because the prospects of what he faces there are so horrific. And special administrative measures are, you know, they're beyond solitary confinement. You know, it's very, very limited contact with a very few people who aren't even allowed to speak to each other about what they've spoken to the person in special administrative measures about. It's used often coercively to get people to agree to a deal. It's just that, you know, people are essentially just cut off from the world. The world's cut off from them. Nobody knows what's going on. They can't tell anyone what's going on. They're isolated. It's just horrendous. It's really astounding that anything like that exists in a so-called democracy, someplace that says it has, you know, the remotest respect for human rights at all. It's, you know, beyond brutal, horrific. I read somewhere that it's the most extreme form of solitary confinement known really in the world. And there's a leaked email that you know, he'll go to Supermax. I think that's from Stratfor, and Supermax has been denounced by the Committee Against Torture and previous UN rapporteurs, because that's solitary and it's brutal, and people are kept in chains and treated like animals, and you know, so the health impacts that are happening now would be intensified, and then, you know, his psychiatrist had said suicide would be a very high risk, understandably, because 175 years, the rest of his life in those conditions, is really unthinkable. For journalism, we have to keep reminding ourselves this is for journalism. It's a democratically protected activity. And he's not being allowed the protections under the First Amendment, the free speech protections. So the US is extraterritorially applying its Espionage Act while withholding the free speech protections of the US Constitution. It's not something they would be able to do to a US citizen. So it kind of makes the rest of the world second-class legal citizens in a way. Journalists outside the US can be subject to US laws, but not protections. So that's my take on it. Just very briefly, when we're just backtrack a weeny bit, when we're talking about you know, people being put off and so on, there was one of the reasons medical neglect has happened in the embassy was a climate of intimidation of doctors, and doctors being afraid to visit the embassy, afraid for their careers, afraid for their families and their reputations. So that climate of smearing and intimidation has had a direct impact on his health and his medical care as well.
Bob, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so, you know, we've talked about his current treatment. it's hard to imagine that that could be made even worse, but certainly extradition would be a ratcheting up of the stress, the psychological torture, the acceleration of underlying physical problems. And, it would be, understandable that under those circumstances, Julian brings forward the end to his torture by taking his own life. It would have a dramatic chilling effect on journalists, whether in mainstream media or alternative media. How can they feel safe under such an environment if the US can take a citizen from a different country under a different jurisdiction and imprison them in their own maximum security prison with so much restrictions placed on them without due process? Nobody in their right mind would take such a risk, and the effect on democracy and the rule of law would be immense. So we must continue to fight this injustice and highlight every step of the way. What are the reasons for doing this? The reasons for doing this is to allow states to continue their corrupt and criminal activities without accountability.
Derek, final thoughts. We're just coming up on the hour.
Well, as you say, the real message is meant to be to the wider journalistic community, and the very idea that there can be free investigation of things that are inconvenient to governments. I think if Julian Assange commits suicide, that would be a reasonably positive outcome for these people in many ways. A point would have been made. I don't think they fear that. I don't think the US government or the UK government fears that. They're going through some sort of process but the main point is to say something about journalism. So that's about all of us then, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings us up on the hour now. So my thanks to Derek Summerfield, to Lisa Johnson, and to Bob Gill from Doctors for Assange for all the work they've done and for their contributions to this discussion. Now, just let me make a couple of points to sum up. The first is that this is an ongoing campaign and we want you to be part of it. Support Doctors for Assange, support the DEA campaign, that's the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. There's going to be another of these broadcasts next Saturday at 6 p.m. BST. That's going to be a discussion with the journalist Stefania Marizzi and with Max Blumenthal. So do look on that. That'll be reviewing some of the issues to do with the spying on Julian Assange and his legal team that took place in the Ecuadorian embassy by the security firm that was supposed to be looking after him. So that is an incredible story, and I'm sure you'll be interested to hear more detail next Saturday about that. And then the following Saturday, the DEA will be returning with another of these broadcasts. So do support those, and do get over to the Don't Extradite Assange website and look at the resources there. If you think that the current condition of Julian Assange and any future prospects of a trial in the United States are as horrendous as the doctors we've talked to today have described them, then you should want to do something about it. So do share the material, do join the campaign, do give us some money. There's a new resolution campaign using the resolution that the National Union of Journalists passed last year as a template for any trade union, any community organisation to express support for Julian Assange. So don't just sit there, do something about it, get over to the DEA website and take some action. Thank you very much for watching. That's it for this program.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
You are listening to Radio.
The best news of all is that courage is contagious. We have this myth sometimes, this myth that the future is something that is fixed, static, out there, waiting to happen to us. But the future doesn't happen to us. It's not fixed. It's not out there. The future is created by us, by the aggregation of the millions of choices each of us makes every day. And so I want to leave you with two questions. Number one, what is the future that we want to create? And number two, do we have the courage to create it?
You are listening to Radio Free Assange. Journalism is no crime. Jail the war criminals. Free Julian Assange.
In democracies, wars are a result of lies. And why one might think that that should lead us to a state of despair, it should lead us also to an optimistic understanding. Because if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth.
No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
I'm Julian Assange.
Roger, I'll get you in constraint.
Editor of WikiLeaks. We've exposed the world's secrets.
These documents belong to the United States government.
Been attacked by the powerful.
The United States strongly condemns.
Hey, quit asking questions. He broke the law.
Illegally shoot the son of a...
Today, we're on a quest for revolutionary ideas that can change the world tomorrow.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell's dictum. Perfect dictum, that he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls internet servers controls the intellectual record of mankind, and by controlling that, controls our perception